My guest this hour is Robert Cherry, Professor Emeritus at Brooklyn College and Fellow Scholar at 1776 Unites. He joined me to talk about his new book, Why the Jews? How Jewish Values Transformed 20th Century U.S. Pop Culture. Here's our first clip. Robert Cherry, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
You have a new book out. It is Why the Jews? How Jewish Values Transformed 20th Century American Pop Culture. So let's start off with why you felt it was important to write this book.
Well, I am Jewish, and I grew up in a relatively traditional Jewish culture. When I became radicalized on the left, there was a left Jewish culture that was separated from the religion and traditional institutions. So it's been part of my life. And one of the things that always intrigued me was that, on the one hand, there's this discussion of Jews and the so-called Einstein syndrome that, they get PhDs, they do research, they're smart and well-educated. But if you look at Jews in the popular entertainment field, particularly at the beginning of the 20th century, these were illiterate, streetwise Jews. They had a fourth grade education. They had a rough and tumble life, yet they rose to prominence, if not domination, of popular culture at the beginning of the 20th century. So there had to be something within Jewish culture beyond education to explain this kind of transformation. So that was one thing. The second thing that intrigued me is I happened to read the autobiography of Count Basie. And what struck me was that his whole career was influenced, if not shaped, by Jews. He starts out in Kansas City, and the club owner, a Jewish club owner, gives him seed money to build his band. His band gets national recognition when the Jewish band leader, Benny Goodman, advertises him. He gets a Jewish manager, Norman Gantz, who pushes his career forward, and he records for Roulette Records, which was owned by Morris Levy. Obviously, it was Count Basie's talent and abilities that were necessary and central, but it was all these Jewish middlemen who were instrumental in taking his career to the heights it was able to go to. So these two things kind of motivated me, and I took a kind of hiatus from doing economic research for a few years to pursue these endeavors. And the book is a result of that.
Obviously, because of that, there's going to be a lot in the book that a heavy portion of the Black-Jewish relationship, and we'll get into a lot of that later.
Yes.
Well, let's go back to the beginning. So these Jews were immigrants like others. These industries, you talk about vaudeville, others, they were already existing. It's not like the Jews started these industries and these types of venues. So let's talk about that progression, like how vaudeville and those things came about, who was running those industries then, and how the Jews kind of, took over that industry.
Well, I begin the book with talking about vaudeville and silent films. If we were sitting here in the 1880s, before the sort of build-up in the beginning of the 20th century of these two industries, we would have bet our money on the Irish Americans having leadership. They were already in a central role in music, what was the saloon culture. They were the major performers. They had the English language, and they had a lot of people. Up until 1910, the major immigrants from Europe to this country continued to be Irish. So we would have expected them to just build on the base they had, and yet it was Jews. The second thing was that Protestants, particularly Thomas Edison formed a monopoly in the motion picture industry, the silent films, where they had control of all of the films that were produced legally in this country. And the same thing happened in early vaudeville. There was a Protestant grouping that also began to dominate, and they did it by having control of bookings. If you didn't book our people, you couldn't get anybody. So it wasn't as if, as you mentioned, Jews were coming into a kind of virgin, unexplored territory, but they were coming in where there already were controls in place to limit competition. And there was an Irish populace that was already centrally in as performers. But as I mentioned in the book, a key thing was religious values. Irish Americans increasingly became dominated by a kind of Catholicism that saw sin as deeply rooted in human psyche and had to be rooted out. So as Irish Catholicism took on this role in this country, controlling the Catholic Church nationally, it made it increasingly difficult for Irish Americans to sustain their involvement in popular cultures. The Irish Americans that we know from that time period who remained the Foys, George M. Cohen and his family, all were from famine Irish roots, families that were not religious and hence were not captive to this new Irish American dogma. And then you had Protestants who had a certain Victorianism where patriarchy was central. And you have, who did Birth of a Nation?
B.W. Griffith.
He was central to putting out pictures that were dominated by a Victorian image of the family, and the triumph of patriarchy was central to many of his movies. Well, Jews didn't have those values. Jews had a much healthier view of sexuality, particularly female sexuality, and so they weren't captives to a kind of Victorianism, and fortuitously for them, neither were the masses of immigrants who came from Europe. That was one of the reasons there was an Americanization campaign by Protestants, by the progressives, because these immigrants just didn't have, from their perspective, the right values. And they had to be transformed. But they weren't. And instead, they went to the kinds of films, the kind of vaudeville shows that Jewish entrepreneurs put out. And so by the second decade of the 20th century, it was Jewish entrepreneurs, both in the vaudeville industry and in silent films, that became dominant.
The religious piece is really important, and I want to talk about that briefly. So the Irish had their control and they were running these businesses, and then the culture changed, and some of the people, as they moved to either religiously or as they moved through different classes, and they got more highbrow and they didn't want certain types of entertainment. They wanted a change, and as people grew closer to Protestantism and they wanted to not live in certain ways, the Jews were able to say, okay, we'll take over those businesses because we don't have those kind of restrictions on bodily pleasures. So
let me just give one example. In the why did the motion picture industry go to Los Angeles? It could have filmed in Florida. It could have done a whole bunch of things. It went to Los Angeles because it was a city they could control, and they could get around Edison and his lawyers and other things because they were using illegally cameras and doing whatever. It was their town, and they could do what they wanted it.
And to the Edison thing you mentioned, his monopoly came from the cameras itself, right? Because of Kodak, right?
He had patents on the camera, and he also had exclusive rights for Kodak film.
Coming up, more with Robert Cherry, author of Why the Jews? How Jewish Values Transformed 20th Century U.S. Pop Culture. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
We return to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer. Once again, here's Charles Love.
Are you tired of summer nights in Maine?
Welcome back. I am talking to Robert Cherry, Professor Emeritus at Brooklyn College, about his new book, Why the Jews? How Jewish Values Transformed 20th Century U.S. Pop Culture. Here we talk about what is unique about the Jewish culture that created the environment where they were able to make such a large impact on the entertainment industry. You and I talked last time, we joked about how Irish and the Jews, how they became white because we keep changing the framework and the definition of what white is. So today, especially in the Black community, you look at Jewish people and you just say they're white. There's no distinction there's no cultural distinction between Jews or Irish or anybody else. It's just white people. But there is a difference, but there was a, stark difference. And I think they had an advantage in the sense that they were able to maintain their culture. In fact, embrace their traditional culture and say there is something, integral to being Jewish that we want to keep, but still not, be so tightly wound religiously, but still tied to that. And other groups aren't really able to do that. So that kind of put them in a unique position, right?
Yes, I think so. I mean, the Jewish culture is much more outward looking in certain ways. Now, this pisses off a lot of people because there are a lot of Jewish guys who write about all kinds of things that are outside of their so-called culture. They get involved politically in communities that come to in a much more open way. And it's just been a certain kind of historical way in which Jews have interjected themselves in ways, sometimes not very good ways, but have injected themselves into other cultures, other more broadly national issues than many other groups. I mean, after all, Chinese Americans only now are being pushed into taking a much more public position on their own needs, whether it's the exclusion that they've had at the Ivy League schools or this spike of anti-Asian violence. Up until this last couple of years, Asians took the approach, we're going to remain quiet, we're going to do what we can for ourselves, but not be public, not inject ourselves. So I think that's an interesting distinction between the Chinese historic approach and the Jewish approach to public policy and issues that go beyond their own community.
You also make a good point about that in the book, where you say that there is something that we don't know if it's unique to the Jewish community, but they definitely have this ability to be able to embrace, uniquely understand, and kind of mix in and interpret many different cultures without actually assimilating. So it's not the same as like, we're going to come in and we're going to act like you per se, where it's more like, we get you, we understand what you're doing, we take what we like, we dismiss what we don't, we can talk, we can hang out with you, we can do this. But on the side, we still maintaining this traditional Jewish culture. So outside of the religious piece, you also have that to contend with.
Well, I think one of the things is the ability to universalize their own experience. Mm-hmm. After all, this week is Passover. One of the things about Passover is not the unique ability of Jews to liberate themselves from slavery. It's seeing that holiday as a signal of all people's liberation from oppression. And that's true even of the most religious Jews, that they see that experience in a universalized way. I mean, I think now Jews have a particular historical presence that may enable them to do this in certain ways, which Chinese and non-Europeans may not be able to do. But I think whether it's in TV or other places, Jewish presentation is seen much more as a universalizing message rather than a kind of narrow personal examples. Anyway, let's get back to...
No, let's get to the part that everybody's really going to find interesting. Let's get to the race of it. So what made them interested in Black music to begin with?
There's a whole history of Jews seeing music as very central, but also in their ability to absorb and adapt to other music. So the so-called klezmer music, which is traditional Jewish, is really an adaptation of 19th century Eastern European, often gypsy music. When Jews got into classical music, after all, Wagner was incensed how they were distorting and manipulating the true nature of opera and classical music. And so it's not surprising when they came to this country and they heard what is often called Black music, they were attracted to it. So the first example of that is ragtime. You have ragtime being presented, and the traditional critics of music, high culture, were appalled by how Jews were trying to put into the American mainstream this vulgar Black music. So you have an immediate reaction, and this is at the turn of the century, to the beginning of the 20th century, where this critic says ragtime is a mere comic strip representation. Here is a rude noise which emerges from the brothels and dives presented in a Negro manner, most often by Jews. And so you have the first, what we'll call Tin Pan Alley music companies producing jazz music. And some of it was Black artists and their tunes. Scott Joplin was the most famous, but many were Jewish. And indeed, Irving Berlin becomes an important person in the music industry, initially by his representation of ragtime. His song, Alexander's Ragtime Band, became the biggest selling ragtime tune ever in the 19-teens, 1915, 1916. So yes, Jews took on ragtime, and it certainly leads to a contentious view of them by many in the Black community, that here was Scott Joplin. He certainly made money, but he never became what Irving Berlin did. And in fact, there were then claims that Irving Berlin stole from him and so on, which just isn't true. But you can understand why there was this tension that was created, where you have this Black originated music form, and the most successful people in it, whether it was the publishing companies or the artists, were Jewish. And the same thing happens in jazz up to the early 1920s. Jazz was considered a a Jewish art form for a long time because whether it was George Gershwin, Jerome Kearns, there were a number of Jewish composers who were associated with the beginning of the broader presentation of jazz, which is now called sweet jazz, to distinguish it from Louis Armstrong and the real jazz that developed in the late 20s and early 30s.
This is probably why white artists get a hard time when they perform R&B or rap still today. More with Robert Cherry, author of Why the Jews? How Jewish Values Transform 20th Century U.S. Pop Culture. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Life's a game of give and take. To prevent the show heartache.
Welcome back. I am talking to Robert Cherry, Professor Emeritus at Brooklyn College, about his new book, Why the Jews? In this segment, we discuss the controversial act of performing in blackface. We talk about how the Irish and blacks and other groups did it as well, and the difference, if any, between the origins of blackface and that was performed in the 20th century.
The main thing is that blackface in the 19th century that you're describing, 1850 through 1880, that blackface was incredibly derogatory. And while at some point the black performers of blackface, and they're actually by the latter part of the 19th century, almost all of the blackface performers in the national companies were black. It was a derogatory, comical kind of presentation, which is typical of vaudeville then, whether it was blackface or not. It would be making fun of the foibles of blacks or Irish or German or Jewish immigrants. There were all kinds of dynamics around the presentations of the Irish servant class, who were seen as being comical in their inability to know which forks to eat with, how to do this or that, as they were servants in wealthy households. And many Irish organizations attacked those Irish characterizations. So while blackface had its own history, and particularly of blacks, it was part of a larger set of presentations that highlighted the inadequacies of non-Western European Protestant groups, what were called WASPs. But when you get to the early part of the 20th century, 1915 to 1940, blackface is entirely different. So, for example, when Eddie Cantor did his blackface during this period, he presented himself as a young, effete, educated black who had taste that you would associate with an elite. And it wasn't that he was comical. He worked with Burt Williams, an important black entertainer, and he would sort of make fun of Burt Williams' character. So it wasn't a derogatory black figure that Eddie Cantor presented. Fanny Brice did a precursor to Ma Rainey. She sang these soulful songs in blackface, and again, they weren't derogatory. You know, one might say, well, why did she do it and not Ma Rainey? But it opened the door in some ways for Ma Rainey and others to do it when you have this precursor. But of course, the main figure was Al Jolson, who did these kind of spiritual longing for a kind of idealized past, you know, Mammy, Mammy, oh, I love you, my old mom, Mammy. And certainly the jazz singer, which was the first talkie he did in blackface. But again, it's complicated. Al Jolson was one of the most beloved entertainers in the Black community. His movies in Black theaters, not just The Jazz Singer, which was loved by the Black community, but a whole series of movies he did were major entertainment. And he was also loved because of how he used his influence to gain recognition for Black performers. Because of him, the first play on Broadway written by a Black writer was done. He brought Black dancers from California to Broadway to be on the stage. He was lauded by the Black Actors Association, who lined up at his funeral in remembrance of him. He also was one of the few who not only helped these Black performers and artists, but he socialized with them. In other words, he went to boxing matches with Black performers. He had them over for dinner in his house. So he wasn't somebody who kept his distance. Now, does that make his Blackface acceptable? Maybe for some it doesn't, but it's certainly for the Black community then, it did. And one should keep in mind that at the Apollo Theater up through the early 1940s, Black comedians wore blackface, and they had to be cajoled, if not threatened, by the NAACP in the early 40s to stop doing it. So, what I'm saying in that period, 1915 to 1940, was substantially different than the earlier period. And while we can have qualms with it, we shouldn't use what happened in the 1880s and 1870s uncritically in evaluating what happened in the 1920s.
Coming up, more with Robert Cherry, author of Why the Jews? How Jewish Values Transformed 20th Century U.S. Pop Culture. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, more of The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am talking to Robert Cherry, Professor Emeritus at Brooklyn College, about his new book, Why the Jews? How Jewish Values Transformed 20th Century U.S. Pop Culture. In this segment, we discuss the role of Jews as middlemen in the entertainment industry and the common perception of them stealing from Black artists. Last, we need to talk about how they became the middlemen in the entertainment industry, managing people, writing the music, owning the studios, all that kind of thing. How'd that come about?
Count Basie, what I mentioned about Count Basie.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what happens is when jazz gets into its dominant form, it's really Louis Armstrong coming up from New Orleans in the late 20s that dramatically transformed what jazz was seen as. Unfortunately, the Depression came and sales of jazz records and other records plummeted. So you have a situation in which the 1930s required a certain amount of accommodation to make Black music financially viable. Louis Armstrong certainly had his fans, but they weren't sufficient in the 1930s. Duke Ellington had his fans, but again, in the 1930s, if you were going to play in music clubs, if you were going to be financially viable, you had to make certain accommodations. And that's where the role of Jewish managers comes into the fore. Both Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington are able to become successful in the 1930s because they accommodated their music under the guidance of their managers. Irving Mills was for Duke Ellington, and Joe Glazer was Louis Armstrong. And again, you have this tension because jazz aficionados looked at what happened to Louis Armstrong in the 30s and particularly in the 50s and 60s as a caricature of himself. You know, he wasn't doing that hardcore jazz of the late 20s that won him committed fans. But he was able to make a lot of money in this new realm.
All right. So what about the what we hear all the time about? So they were able to bring them to the masses and give them opportunities they didn't have before. But the perception now that as we look back on it, is that they were ripping the artist off and stealing the music, like you mentioned before, or not paying them and all those kind of things.
Well, that's more the record companies. Managers are more complicated. But let me just take the case of Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong would always he'd be on the road 250 days a year. I mean, he'd live for being on the road and performing. Every night he had two pockets full of money. One was for his spending and one was money he gave away. He was an incredibly generous person, but there was no tomorrow for him. He was going to be on the road and he'll make more money. So what did Joe Glazer did? When in the 60s, he had an unexpected hit. What Joe Glazer did was say to the record company, you don't give Louis Armstrong money now. You set up an annuity so that he would have money in his old age. It was like a pension. Mm-hmm. And Glazer did it because of the style of behavior that I described. And Armstrong and particularly his wife were able to have very comfortable retirement years because of these annuities that were set up. Mm-hmm. So it was a kind of paternalistic. I would say that one of the things that happened in the music industries, often Jewish managers, but also Jewish record company owners, often took on a paternalistic attitude. Does that make it better or worse? But certainly in the case of Armstrong, his inability to look to the future in his spending was really much more of an issue than he was being ripped off by Joe Glazer, where Joe Glazer was able to not so much rip off Louis Armstrong, but be able to build on Louis Armstrong. He had a promotion company, ABC, where he represented artists and was able to get them performances. What he did is he would piggyback. He'd say, if you want Louis Armstrong to perform in your venue, then you have to take on these other performers that I have. You know, so was he ripping off Louis Armstrong? Maybe Louis Armstrong. Certainly Louis thought that he should have gotten a piece of that ABC company. But, you know, that was the way in which Glazer was able to build on the success of Louis Armstrong for his own personal gain.
Coming up, our final segment with Robert Cherry, author of Why the Jews? How Jewish Values Transform 20th Century U.S. Pop Culture. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
I need a dollar, that's what I need.
Welcome back. This is the last segment with Robert Cherry, author of Why the Jews? How Jewish Values Transform 20th Century U.S. Pop Culture. In this last segment, I asked Robert what we should take away
from that relationship between blacks and Jews in the entertainment industry. We know the perceptions, but what is the most important thing he wants people to know about that relationship and the Jews' impact on pop culture?
The most important thing of this discourse here is that Black music came to the fore and is central to American culture. So that's the main story. Now, in terms of the role of Jews in popular culture, it's not what it was, nor should it be necessarily. I think a lot of the kind of entry point of religious values, I mean, we all now live in a hedonistic society. You know, the Jewish attitude of sex, drugs, and rock and roll is pretty Americanized now.
Not unique, right?
Not necessarily to the best. You know, so we're living in a different era. And I think by and large, the Jewish role was constructive. And while it certainly had its rough edges and its exploitive aspects, the end was what counts, and that is placing Black music where it belongs. And I think the Jewish role accelerated that.
And finally, why do you believe there is still so much animosity towards Jews in the Black community?
To some extent, it's a mystery to me, the longevity, the intensity of anti-Jewish attitudes. As I mentioned before, I think to some degree it's a bad taste sometimes how Jews inject themselves into what seems like other people's business. I think today one of the issues is, you know, while there certainly are many Jews who are part of the kind of woke anti-racist movement, there are also very prominent Jews that are very critical of this woke movement. So they're very prominent in ways that can be annoying to people. Oh, no, I mean, I'm annoying to my own family about other people, right? So, you know, they're kind of argumentative.
You're like, mind your own business.
No, there's really that aspect. And I think they do have certain historical values that just are uncomfortable for others. And they've been successful. And so there's a certain jealousy at times. You know, it's hard to pin down why, but don't forget what we hear about the Black community, by and large, is from activists. We're not hearing from the populace. So it's very complicated to say what the Black community in this age of Twitter and podcasts, where you have a very small sliver of the Black community having inordinate influence over perceptions.
He is Robert Cherry, professor emeritus at Brooklyn College and author of the new book, Why the Jews? How Jewish Values Transform 20th Century American Pop Culture. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you for having me again.